The fifth lecture is devoted to the theology of society. Society as a subject of theology. Such a topic may seem rather strange to modern consciousness, which is accustomed to the fact that a specialized science deals with society, sociology, that society is the subject of a specific practical study, including mathematical, statistical methods at an empirical, quantitative level. Such a topic may be perceived by some as a radical, perhaps unfounded, unsupported complaint. In fact, the approaches to society that today dominate the humanities, according to which society is the subject of a quantitative, statistical, empirical study, is a rather late era in the development of social disciplines. And we can even say that in its current final form, this method was introduced after the First World War, when bourgeois social disciplines, leading a polemic with the then powerfully dominant Marxism, were fundamentally oriented to dismantle the conceptual global vision of the social factor, the public thing, and study it in such a creeping, empirical way. In other words, bourgeois sociologists suggested, as it were, climbing like a sort of nerd, through tunnels and stones, over flowers with a magnifying glass, descriptively describing vulgar empiricism. Here there is a struggle with a global etymological vision through creeping empirical descriptivism. And naturally, where there is descriptivism, there is a figure. But what is interesting is that behind this current modern sociology, so descriptive, empirical, focused on details, facts, polls, questionnaires, still dominates some understanding of society, a certain paradigm of what modern human thinks about society. In the head of a modern human there is a certain understanding of this, and it easily comes through in times of crisis on the pages of newspapers, in the speeches of journalists. When the nomenclature party system of the Soviet government collapsed and journalists began to ideologize public discourse, they began to say that society hires officials, hires statehood for itself, etc. Before that, they showed some archetypal ideas, one might say, liberal bourgeois. Where is their root? After a certain analysis of the history of the issue, it should be concluded that the fundamental model of what is associated in the head of a modern person with the concept of society should be recognized as the philosophy of Hobbes. It is the discourse of Hobbes, it is his concept of society that underlies the modern profane idea of what society is. This concept belongs to early nationalism, it is a turning point from the 17th to the 18th century. And at the heart of this Hobbesian vision lies the idea of society as a collection of natural individuals who are preoccupied with selfish survival, the consumption of goods, self-defense. The fundamental substance that binds all people is their fear of each other. Human is a wolf to human. This society is like a scattering of atomic individuals who are afraid, do not understand, hate each other, and have no common goal. They see each other as a means and as a tool. Together they are a swarm of predators who are preoccupied with snatching, seizing, devouring, consuming. Therefore, they are dangerous to each other, constantly fighting with each other. For security purposes, they conclude an agreement among themselves that they will put a government over themselves, a state that they will hire, so that this state, in the person of an absolute ruler, will protect them. It would establish the law and beat on the fingers of him who disobeyed. And I must say that for Hobbes, as well as for Louis the Son, the state and the ruler were synonymous. Since everyone is predators, but at the same time infantiles who cannot take two steps and are in a state of frantic snatching a piece from each other on the sight, and the ruler, like a trainer with a whip, drives everyone to the corners and says, "Guys, carefully, be careful, there is enough for everyone." In other words, what is the ideology of society according to Hobbes? It is a combination of absolute individualism, from which absolute absolutism follows, if I may say so. And a strange variant, which suddenly awakens in some way in Dostoevsky in The Possessed, is when Shegelev speaks. Reading notebooks, he says with pathos, well, starting with absolute equality and ending with absolute inequality. Here is a very strange paraphrase of Hobbes. Hobbes starts with absolute individualism on the platform of the youngsters and deduces from this, of necessity, total absolutism as a kind of necessary dictatorship. The natural law for Hobbes is the need to defend oneself, and the right, which is developed in the course of a social contract, is a restriction of freedoms so that people do not gnaw each other out and everything is enough for everyone. This is the simple picture that Hobbesian philosophy of society presents, and it should be said that it is not much different from what is in the head of the layman when you ask him what human society is. He will say the exact same thing. Hobbes simply clearly expressed the paradigm of social common ideas from the street. It is fear of each other, the individualism of atomic human beings consumers, over which stands the arbiter state, replacing natural law, the natural right of self-defense and war of all against all with a certain consensus in which people must abide by certain conventions, otherwise they will be punished. In Hobbes we see the theory of fear and the theory of extreme anticharism, decharism of man and society. This is opposed by a doctrine that considers society hue and man as a sacred fact or its extreme poles. Above, we examined the common, Philistine notion that prevails among journalists today and is visible in the mentioned discourse that we are bourgeois, our task is to consume and feel comfortable, we want security, we hired the state, etc. Although it is already clear to all of us that no bourgeois hired the state, and the state is just as if through its teeth, it can allow it, and if it does not want to, then it will not allow both society and the state. Hobbes' concept suffers very much, oddly enough, with all its vulgar empiricism, profanity and apparent rationality, rather naive idealism, because neither history, nor practice, nor a simple analysis of social fact proves to us that people who are afraid of each other conclude some kind of social contract. This is a rather mythical action, that is, at first glance it seems rational, reasonable, but imagine how atomic individuals, who are not bound by anything except a selfish desire to snatch a piece, consume it, and at the same time a thirst for security, converge and conclude an agreement. Where do they develop the criteria, on what site, how do they ensure that the entire amount of these atomic dust particles, suspended geodust particles, join such a treaty? Some part conclude this agreement and some part remains outside its framework, and they must be connected to this agreement by force. With Hobbesian supposedly rational, profane, and understandable picture, many more questions arise than answers are given. At the other extreme is the concept of the traditional idea of society, the extreme and most sacred traditionalist form of which is the Indian caste society, and the idea of it, which in modern times, in the 20th century, is reproduced in the teachings of traditionalists, primarily René Guénon. This society is a mold, a collective embodiment of the great being, and is located according to its organs. It represents the global archetype of a being crucified between heaven and earth. Moreover, the caste of priests corresponds to the head of this great being, the caste of warriors corresponds to the chest, the caste of vaishyas, that is, the bourgeoisie, merchants and artisans, to the stomach, and the sudras are below and are dust on the feet. The functions of these castes are fundamental and archetypal and inherent in the functions of the great being, which in itself is already a mediator between heaven and earth, between the completely dense, rough, and completely slender, subtle. The great being drives the gross energies of the thonos upward, and drives the subtlest subtle energies of the sky or the subtle, superformal, worlds downward, making them dense, that is, rarefaction and condensation occur. Within this, there are four functions. Brahmins, or priests, who exist everywhere from the point of view of traditionalism, are an innate function of human. Each human, at least in a normal archetypal society, is born one of the four elements in its pure form, and if it is mixed, then this is already a chandala, an attack and a parody of the caste. Brahmin, born even in France, even in India, is a person who, according to his archetype, contemplates this, as we have said repeatedly, a fundamental property of a person from infancy, with an open gaze, absorbs a certain infinity of the window. It is most perfectly represented in people specially gifted for this purpose. These are priests who have intellectual intuition, contemplatives, and in their physical existence they embody law, immutability, constancy, an axis around which the variety of things revolves, called law, or dharma, or the axis of the world. Recall that we talked about the child who for the first time learns about his mortality. While he contemplates the sky, he falls, breaks his knee and feels that he is fragile, his contemplation is limitless, and he is mortal and fragile. It is this contradiction that contains a certain vector towards fundamental constancy, towards the establishment of the status quo, towards overcoming the fragility of that contemplative basis that is associated with the physical subject. It is already the will to ensure that the physical base, that is, the contemplator himself, does not differ in its infinity, fundamentality, and invulnerability from the act of contemplation itself. This striving is embodied in the idea of constancy, in the idea of law, and in the idea of continuity of the corporate caste, which functionally carries out this contemplation. This is what the priests are. These are people par excellence, these are people in their purest form, only they are people with a capital letter. In an act of contemplation at their own level, at the level of our world, they reproduce the distillation of energy up and down, that is, the mediation between heaven and earth. Next come the warriors. Who are they? These are passionaries, whose business is violence and self-sacrifice. They are like a fire that spreads and devours everything, and it must be controlled by the contemplative principle, which uses this fire as a working productive movement, as a result of which the society goes somewhere. Warriors protect, warriors prove, and if necessary, warriors sacrifice themselves. These passionaries are a kind of higher, elite expendable material. Next come the bourgeois, who correspond to the belly of Brahma. Their business is mediation, mediation between human and the environment, metabolism, called the process of economic reproduction, the exchange between groups of people and people of goods. These are artisans and merchants whose business is contract, mediation, mediation either through hands or socially. An artisan makes a jug out of copper, and first he finds, produces this copper, then he makes a work out of it, and then he sells it. The whole sphere of this curation of copper in various forms, up to a jug that is placed in someone's house, is the sphere of material metabolism, and all this is at the mercy of the third caste. But the fourth caste, the Shudras, they have no purpose, they are just reproduced slaves who are used for unskilled work, and may even be unemployed, just human dust in the wind, the proletariat, the Shudras. Interestingly, parallel to this structure are people who come out of all these categories, either because they rebelled, or because they broke the rules of the game, or because they are not a pure but a mixed type. These are Chandalas. Chandalas are characterized by the fact that they parody any of these four castes. And the most popular and most famous are the lumpen proletariat, those who parody the Shudras. Because it turns out that the Shudras, these honest, legitimate robots, can be parodied. And in this regard, the lumpen proletariat is an aggressive unemployed who drinks beer in bars, husks sunflower seeds, and is ready to start breaking shop windows with cobblestones. He would have to go to work on a call, to a factory, and instead he wanders around like an aggressive unemployed. Imagine that there are in fact such chandals as lumpen priests, or lumpen warriors, or lumpen bourgeoisie. And our Russian oligarchs are typical representatives of the lumpen bourgeoisie, that is, they are not an estate and they are not rooted in anything. By force of circumstances they are thrown into a certain position of supervising the flow of material wealth. But in reality, they are neither soul nor body akin to this, and if, for example, without money abroad, they will not be able to even lead a more or less tolerable existence, as has already been proven more than once. This is a picture polar to Hobbes. This is a sacred society which for this world is a kind of physical embodiment of the great being, its collective development and detailing. It should be said directly that between these two poles, theology has no preferences for any of these pictures. It does not consider society from the point of view of the sacred, Vedic vision of society, and it does not stand on the positions of Hobbes. Despite this, it uses to some extent the argumentative material that is objectively contained in these two positions. In fact, castes really exist. The typology of people really exists. Even when we speak from the point of view of human brotherhood and human unity, community, in terms of monotheism, we cannot but take into account that people are innately related to one of the fundamental, main models of human existence. This fact is reflected in the Quran. It says, for example, that those who fight are not equal to those who stay to give water to the pilgrims or to carry out the functions of real economic reproduction. Such indications, without emphasizing the caste issue, clearly signify that people belong to different modalities, different archetypes of manifestations. Nevertheless, society appears to theology as something completely different. First of all, I want to draw your attention to the fact that man has not opposed the cosmos for a long time. If we look at folklore and its cosmogonic aspects, how the creation of human is described in the great scriptures, then there are always three main components: the created human, the God who created him, who speaks to him, and the earth on which God places this man and puts him in some central position. There is land, water, plants, animals, a garden. In the middle of this garden is a human. There are three of these moments: human, his creator, and his cosmic environment. And if we look at these fundamental realities, which are already engraved in our unconscious like on steel or copper, are well rooted in us, then we will understand that in modern human they are all replaced by one fact that works for all three elements: society. Society, it turns out, replaces the cosmos, the external world for us. We do not work with the cosmos, we are not people, placed in the middle of the earth, the planet, where the desert with its mountains, the sky with the stars above us, and we are placed in the center. We look at all this, communicate, draw some vectors to stars, mountains, trees. No, we have long been completely anthropogenic products. Our outer world, our cosmos, is an electric fire in the glass windows of skyscrapers. Our skies are hazy with smog, and even when we go, like Thor Heyerdahl on the Kon-Tiki, into the ocean, this is a social action. Heroic and extreme encounters with nature are deeply PR actions. These are actions that are associated with the subsequent writing of a book or, like Fyodor Kanyukov, are directly accompanied by a demonstration of a documentary film. In general, for us there is no ocean, no stars, no air, no elements. There is a society that has completely replaced the cosmos. This is a kind of second circuit, like an egg, which isolates us from what used to be called the elements. This is the first moment. The second point: society is in the minds, in the instincts of the vast majority of people. So overwhelming that it replaces God. In their minds, society appears as a society god. It is a socio-theos, a socio-theological embodiment of what a human imagines as God. And he, a human, hasn't imagined anything for a long time. He says that he believes in everything good, in the good. If at least, like Plato or like Socrates, he believed in an abstract good as some kind of pure being, as a logically isolated indicative, it would already be interesting. But by the good, he understands simply society in its self-sufficient and simple independence and self-reliance. Society has long become synonymous with the good with a capital letter. Society that is protected, balanced, self-reproducing, is a kind of total irrevocable positive. And if we talk about the fact that a human needs an idea of spin as a substance, that there is something united that has never begun, will never end, has an unlimited extent, is everywhere, it has no alternative, it is impossible to oppose it, then if it is both God and nature, so in Spinoza, then for modern human this substance is society. It seems unthinkable to a modern person that there was a time when there was no society, and a time will come when there will be no society. And although Hollywood makes such films, but these are all unconvincing experiments in the fantasy genre, and, in addition, note, some new post-society is shown there. Society is irrevocable. And Hollywood can experiment, and the layman knows, both at the level of the subcortex and at the level of the solar plexus, that wherever you go, the social fact overshadows everything. Even other planets are understood only through the prism of society. This is a project of space exploration, these are flights to Mars, etc. In order to illustrate this idea, it is easiest to turn to the philosophy of Russian cosmists, for whom expansion into other worlds is connected with the main problem of society in a deeply pagan sense, with the cult of ancestors, their resurrection, relationships with them. In the minds of modern people, society has already replaced the cosmos, that is, the garden in which God placed man, replaced God, and, finally, society replaces human. There is no human. There is a society without which a human is a kind of myth, a kind of virtuality. Already Aristotle assured that human is a social animal, and Marx called the very idea of isolating a human from residential publica, that is, from social space, from a social image, a myth. Thus, society is something that acts as a substantive or, relatively speaking, monetary component of the three fundamental aspects that form the whole reality for us: God, cosmos, human, God, earth, human. Instead of all this, a certain grayness arises, a certain indefinite, quantitative, diverse, but at the same time homogeneous longing, which is called society. We talked about the fact that Descartes considered two substances, extended and thinking. But he did not mean that substance is a substratum, but considered them as two independent realities. One is extension, and the other is like a point, as its mental limitation, which is the sensation or self-existence of some nothing that limits this extension, opposed to it. In society, there is a unity of these two substances. What is society in terms of Cartesian terminology? This is thinking extension. It is a complete fusion of these two realities. Now it is no longer possible, speaking of society, to say cogito ergo sum, since thinking extension does not presuppose doubt and crisis in its myth, in its presentation, in what it imposes. It does not imply the search that led Descartes to isolate this criterion, I think, therefore I am. Thinking extension simply is, it is as an opinion, as an information flow. Let's look at this triangle, where one vertex is the concept of Hobbes, which exists in the minds of most people who believe that society is the product of an agreement between individuals. This is a kind of profane myth about society. The other peak is the sacred idea of society, where it is seen as a giant collective, mannequin, imitating the great being. Such a society is hierarchically structured, in which each of its members has its own function, because it is a collective mannequin rooted in the cosmos, that is, between heaven and earth. We call this the Vedic concept of society. And here is the third peak, here is the society we are talking about. This is a society that is both God, and human, and the cosmos, which is a kind of real fact, because we are dealing with this real fact, it is presented to us. If we say, we are surrounded by being, we are surrounded by the world, we are pressed by fate, circumstances, all this does not apply either to being, or to the world, or to fate, or to circumstance, etc., but presses on us, namely society. Whatever we call space, time, etc., is society. This third society we will call Taghat, a special word, it is borrowed from the Quranic text. Taghat is an idol of idols. This is a terrible huge idol, claiming totality, everything. This is a Taghat, we drew it on top, because it is not only a concept, it is reality itself. But it is also a concept. It feeds on both the juices of profanity and the juices of the sacred. Hobbes has absolutely no idea of hierarchy. What is a Hobbesian society? This is an atomic whirlwind of individuals who are hunting for food, for the satisfaction of their physical needs, and they, having agreed among themselves, invited the ruler. And in the sacred, Vedic idea of society, hierarchy is the most important component, because the function of society is to translate the lower circle of the ontology upward, into the subtle dimension, and vice versa. This ascent and descent of verticals is a plenary fact of the sacred concept of society. In the third case, we see an amazing thing, there is a hierarchy here, but it is perverted, and fundamentally perverted. This hierarchy is, as it were, reversed. In such a society, there are all functions, both priestly, and military, and others, but they are taken with a minus sign. It turns out a strange, poisonous combination of Hobbesian profane denial of hierarchy, a crude functionality based on the idea of security, and sacred hierarchy. They in their alloy form what we find in a genuine, real, modern society. It is a mistake to think that such a society has appeared now, in a terrible profane time. It has always been. It manifests the tagut, idolocratic, anti-divine essence of society which took place in ancient India, and in ancient Iran, and in ancient Egypt. Behind all these hierarchies, pyramids, pharaohs, there was a society that actually claims to be everything, and replace everything, and not be anything truly. It was simply hidden, like some kind of virtual poison. In the era of the open domination of the priesthood, this poison was a mask that made it possible to interpret in a very cosmic, very beautiful, very sacred all those things that we today describe as the power of Satan, the coming of the Antichrist, the domination of false elites, the totality of the social fact, alienation, radical paternalism, that tramples on freedom. All these elements, which now exist only in an unsightly form, were virtually hidden already here. And Hobbes, who believes that society is a rabble of atomic predators, actually illustrates this transitional moment, this profane consciousness. It is that watershed when the mask is thrown off. At some point, the society of kings and lords, sacred values, bell ringing, throws off its mask and turns out to be a society like a tagut, like an idol. At this moment of unmasking, profane consciousness arises, and Hobbes is its first sign. Then this profane consciousness is fixed already at street level. The journalist, the layman remains with this consciousness. But if we analyze the self-awareness of this society at the level of its ideologists, those clubs that plan why this society exists, we will see that the highest oligarchic power is returning to a hierarchical assessment of itself, to a new sacredness. This is a new false sacredness, but this, one might say, is the risen mummy of the pharaoh, which is not a living pharaoh, but a kind of parody of him. Nevertheless, the connection with that society is direct. The profane consciousness arose at the moment of throwing off the mask and was preserved. How, after all, does this society arise, or rather, how is this society realized as some kind of, relatively speaking, anti-spiritual fact? It must be admitted that society replaces man, God, and the cosmos. Society stands in their place. This is such a substitution that has absorbed us, our ideals, and the reality in which we could contact at the level of feelings. It turned everything into itself. And what is it in its deepest definition? It is difficult to define it otherwise than apophatically, that is, negatively, but negatively in a conditional way. Society is anti-spirituality. Moreover, if someone believes that the complete antithesis of the spirit is the body, he is mistaken. The complete antithesis of spirit is society. How does this anti-spirituality arise? I will try to explain it. In the beginning there was a certain cosmos, a myth. Mythologically, we are dealing in cosmological concepts, in Greek myths with the great Olympus, on which Zeus, Hera, and other deities are located. Below, at the foot of this Olympus, people are swarming, subject to decay, fate, a combination of circumstances. They are mortal, doom prevails over them. They are miserable and unhappy. They don't even know how to take a spoon to their mouths. And there is Prometheus, a cultural hero, a titan who steals fire from the Olympians and gives it to people. Thus, he makes of people a kind of community that can work with the environment, can provide for itself, be self-sufficient, that is, partially appropriate the features of the Olympians, comfort, good, abundance, excess, due to this stolen fire. What the hero does is a powerful step towards the transformation of people into society. What's happening? In the cosmos, a truly great being or a person similar to the great being arises, but in its antithesis, because the Olympians are the great hypostases of this great being. And here someone opposite comes to them, similar to them, but opposite, and steals the fire from them. Because he considers their status as a great being unfair, it is unfair that they are immortal, that they are the essence of being, and this is not dynamic, not project. He steals this certain property from them, for which he is chained to a rock, his liver is pecked by an eagle. Simply put, here it is, the big cosmos, here is the sky, here is the earth, and here stands Aleph, that is, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which symbolizes the creature whose one hand is lowered to the earth, and the other is raised to the sky, and which overtakes through oneself. Subtle energies go down, gross energies go up. This is the great being, the son of earth and sky, who is inside this cosmos. And Prometheus steals fire from him, who is crucified upside down on this great cosmos and indulges in shameful execution, shameful torment. In this way, a kind of counterbody of the great being arises, the punished Titan. And now the punished, crucified Titan, a cultural hero, chained to a rock, is the embodiment, the summary, a brief meaning, the archetype of the progenitor of this society, which replaces everything. He is crucified and in torment. Why? Because he stole some secret of confrontation from the cosmos, opposition to what acts inexorably in the cosmos. And inexorably in the cosmos acts doom, the second law of thermodynamics, everything dies, everything tends to cool. Descartes said that an effect cannot be greater than its cause. This is the great phrase of Descartes, which kills Darwin to death, the theory of evolution, the theory of progress. This phrase is, in fact, deeply scientific, and you can't go around it on any curve. The effect cannot be greater than its cause. You can't get a well out of a bucket. You can remove a bucket from the well, but vice versa, it does not work. A kettle removed from the fire cannot boil. Everything becomes colder and tends to the final. This is the universal law of thermodynamics. But it is a physical representation of that doom that the ancients spoke of with such constant vehemence, that the heroes defied. Prometheus steals fire, a secret substance that burns and does not burn out under the cover of a substance that smolders and does not char. But behind this mask, the paper and wooden mask of the present being, that substance rages, which is the heating. Yes, a kettle taken off the fire will be cold, but put on it will boil. And this fire is stolen and becomes a human factor, but Prometheus is chained to a rock, crucified and tortured. And what happens with it? There is a public that imitates counter-entropic mechanisms, that is, society. Why does it replace everything? Because within the society there is anti-entropy, counter-entropy, but it works in such a way that it is already doom of the second order. It is the second circuit of doom. We can say that entropy is the rising of the sun that sets in the west, the transition from 1 to 0. Entropy that moves in the big cosmos. But the society with which we are dealing instead of the cosmos is a counter-arrow, the second contour of doom, as it were, a counter-entropy. All the mechanisms of society are based on the idea of counter-entropy, on growth, on reproduction, on stability, on security, on expansion. And the most important element here, everything is brought into the idea of the good, into the idea of a religious project, into the idea of the religious self-assessment of society as something that should blossom, grow, etc. The most important counter-entropic project is money, because it only grows. The table, which was bought for $1, fell apart a long time ago, but this $1 that was spent on the table turned into $300 to $400. Money, which is the circulatory system of society, is the most pronounced, aggressive manifestation of the anti-entropic predestination of society. But they operate within, this is the second circuit. And small people, instead of standing in the center of the earth, stand in the middle of society. And we must stand not in the middle, but on the side, because anyone who is aware of himself as a person, and not a member of society, who positions himself as a point on the surface, anyone who is aware of himself as a lonely individual, is nothing more than a marginal, that is, standing on the side. We are standing somewhere, looking, and our horizon is the doom erasing us. Doom still erases us like Greek heroes, but it is only its second contour that erases us. We are dealing with it. Our barrier, our wall, our oppression is not in the stars and not in the ticking of the world clock. Of course, this is there, but we do not hear it. This ticking does not reach our level. We are isolated. We, like mice in our ecosystem, believe that there is nothing but this whole. We are dealing with the ultimate horizon, which for us is oblique and annihilating, although it emerged as a vector against cosmic entropy. This is anti-entropy, but in a paradoxical way it does not increase us, does not make us immortal, strong, invulnerable. On the contrary, it destroys and erases us, turns us into camp dust. It throws us into prisons and camps, it harasses us at work, in the family, it turns us into slaves of conventions, it fills our consciousness with an information flow. And these are only the smallest, most peripheral and most insignificant of those outrages that this second circuit of doom does to us, working all the time for growth, for increase, for animation. Here, relatively speaking, we find ourselves in the armpit of Prometheus. The fact is that the central position of human, which God speaks about in the Quran, who placed human in the center of the earth so that he would be his vicar, is stolen and usurped by our society, which, instead of human, instead of the earth and instead of God, is that thinking extension, in which the center is everywhere, and the periphery is the heart of the individual. Well, or you can say that the periphery is nowhere. But this is the real nowhere, this is a black hole inside the heart, this is freedom, which is an absolute periphery and an absolute marginal in relation to society. Now a few words about how this social mechanism works. What I have described briefly at this third top point of the triangle is society as a theological fact. Indeed, it is a theological fact, because it claims to be instead of God, a substitute, a usurpation of God, a socio-theos. It is indeed a theological fact, acknowledged every day by the same practicing Catholic who goes to church and whispers his petty and insignificant confessions about his own meager and mean life into the ear of an invisible priest. And here is an explanation of why this priest at such a moment is for him the Lord God himself, but in fact he is not God at all. The ear of the priest is the ear of society, which is instead of God. And this is the only reason why the priest manages to convince that at the moment, in this confessional, he appears as Christ, and the penitent sinner does not instinctively feel that this priest is the ear of society. Yes, he would never have believed that the priest is Christ. But the fact is that in the head of a poor person, society, priest, Christ, in general, everything has long been mixed up, because he knows that he does not exist, but there is society as a thinking extension. I told you that in this society, in this satanic anti-spiritual mechanism, there is a hierarchy with a minus sign. Indeed, this hierarchy exists, indeed it arose at a certain time. There was a time when there was a sacred hierarchy, also, not sugar, to put it mildly. The pharaohs trampled the ground and said to the peoples they conquered or kneeling slaves, or senators, satraps, I am your spiritual lord. Pharaoh declared himself, I am a god. And in fact it was logical and constructive, but in the sense of God that the Pharaoh had in mind. Not in the understanding of God that Moses or Muhammad or Jesus, peace be upon them all, had in mind, but in the way the Pharaoh thought to himself. And it was logical and not at odds with reality. You just need to keep in mind that the Pharaoh meant something completely different by this word and content. But today the club authorities, that hierarchy, which is the last recipient of dividends from the existence of a social fact, who is it? And why are they? And in general, is there a connection between the current neo-pharaohs who have risen from the graves, the mummies of the resurrected pharaohs, and those pharaohs? Is there any connection between those and these? Yes, there are. Straight. The current pharaohs, the current princes of the world are the direct heirs of those pharaohs. I want to say that society in this regard is like a ship floating in time, and this ship is usually denoted in Arabic, in Islamic symbolic practice by the letter Nun. The letter Nun is associated with the name Noah, and it symbolically expresses his ark, the ark on which he sailed to save a certain grain, a certain continuity of the future human after the flood from the world's waters. At the same time, the letter Nun is a symbol of the Islamic crescent, and the Islamic crescent is by no means a designation of the moon, as many people think. It is a designation of a cup. A universal symbol that is present in both Judaism and Christianity is the cup. There is a cup, and there is also what is inside it. In order to better understand the symbolism of society, we will immediately single out, as it were, two different moments, on the one hand, a cup, and on the other hand, an ark, or a boat. Well, here, relatively speaking, we will have a pyramid, inside of which lies the mummy of the pharaoh. This is the original society that arises after Prometheus steals the fire and gives the divine dimension of counter-entropy to people. As a result, they can carry out direct communication and metabolism with the outside world and be a factor of order, a factor of growth and a factor of internal concentration of consciousness, a kind of mental experience, at the limit of which, at the peak of which there is a feeling of bliss as a kind of constant. This is what arises in a primary society, independent of and freed from the laws of direct entropy, protected from the laws of direct entropy. This society is like an immovable cup that contains certain wealth, a pearl, something else, and it exists in this macro circuit. But the problem is that this bowl, this society exists within the contour of time, from 1 to 0, from east to sunset, and in the center is this society. The second law of thermodynamics and time are one and the same. Every second you have to pay for your existence. It's order, it's not chaos. Everything cools down, and this is a decrease in information. The more positions of the Brownian motion, the more chaos, the less information, the entropy grows. Society is order, but time erases it, and every second you need to throw something into the mouth of this time in order to move on. Where to take it from? It's some kind of energy. Energy must be taken from people. Energy is taken from people through direct exploitation, through alienation, through indirect exploitation, mental, psychological, moral and other engagement. Who takes the energy? Energy is taken by those who are placed from above, nobility. These are the priests who have the right to take energy, these are the pharaohs, who are specifically the channel of this energy and transfer it to the cosmos, these are the satraps, who work more narrowly, and the grassroots, priests, who already deal with the people, they take this energy. Well, at first glance, it is almost mystical. And they give it to the cosmos so that tomorrow, with a new day, this society, this public, this cup would be the same as today. But the fact is that the spiral of time is twisting, and every day it moves and presses faster, and tomorrow you have to give more, and under the pharaoh there are 3 million bare-assed slaves, around whose hips there are only towels and in their hands as the main tool a wheelbarrow or mattock. Well, you can raise the level of collection for 100 years, 1,000, 1,000,000 years, but at some point the racketeer, in the form of the cosmos, raises the stakes, and society in its current form cannot pay for its existence in immutability today, so that tomorrow it will be same, cannot pay an increasing amount. Renting a place in the sun is getting more expensive by the second. And then it becomes necessary to reformat the society in order to change the human factor, and it would be possible to get more energy, more resources from it, to remove more oil by exploitation, which will be pumped into this cosmos. And as soon as reformatting begins, this cup turns into a floating ark. It sets off on the waves, on the ocean of time, swimming faster and faster. But the task is that the more everything changes, the more everything remains the same. Therefore, the nobility is being reformatted, the hierarchy is being reformatted, the bourgeois are replacing the bare-assed slave, who was wrapped in a skin. Instead of exploiting and removing the energy potential from the unfortunate wretched human, and burnt out under the sun with protruding ribs and collarbones, from which you can get only a certain number of calories of physical work, we have a bourgeois who sits on the couch, whose children study in college, who goes to the club, goes in for sports, is tied to 100 social connections, spins like a squirrel in a wheel. His brains are just a terminal in the branches of the information flow that permeates society. He does not have that inner field at all, about which Marx said that a human is completely free only when he sleeps. The bourgeois is not free even when he sleeps. He goes to a Freudian psychoanalyst and trusts him with his dreams. He lies down on his bunk and sleeps socially, sleeps in his presence, under the tape recorder, which records his last anguish and the last peep of his unconscious. All. The bourgeois gives the last of himself, the bourgeois gives all his fat, which can be expelled from a human being. To whom does he give it? Yes, all the same gentlemen of anti-spirituality. He gives it to the class of priests who keep their lips to the ear of the nobility, the same club nobility, which is the same channel for pumping this energy into the cosmos in order for the social fact to be total. Why is a social fact total? Yes, in order to ensure the immutability, reproduction, security, and all other characteristics of the ontus that are inherent in spin as a substance, beginninglessness, indestructibility, infinity, etc., good. But this good is also a religious category. And to know which takes the last grams of human energy in order to pay for tomorrow to be like today and like yesterday, carries out a religious mission. It guarantees continuity, stability, it is legitimate. Legitimacy is taken precisely from here, from the fundamental ability to ensure that tomorrow is like today and yesterday, that is, from the fact of reproduction of immutability. That which is unchanging, that which has the power to exercise its immutability, is what is legitimate, and therefore it is religious. For the good has the features of immutability, permanence, and indestructibility. But this is nothing else than this terrible residential publicum, which in reality is residential pharaonicum. This is the very society that is subject to explosion and destruction, because for a revolutionary who is a lonely hero, a marginal, there is a task to unchain, free Prometheus, remove him from this rock, kill an eagle pecking his liver, and thus go through the liquidated society to the first circle of global entropy. To go out in order to restore the Trinity, God, human, cosmos, it is through the revelation of the covenant to overcome the fundamental law of the second law of thermodynamics, which does not allow us to defeat this society, which has replaced the second law of thermodynamics with empty, meaningless virtual growth, which means nothing more than our total slavery and spiritual death. And the information society is the last, ultimate structure that charges humanity a fee that is already greater than what it could give ontologically and literally, because in the information society virtual energy is already being charged from virtual people. Already in the next lecture, we will talk about what this energy is, how it is connected with freedom, and what is the principle of uncertainty which turns into the energy of the future. Into the energy that is connected with what is not yet there. So now we are finishing with society, and in the next lecture we will start talking about the intellectual jihad project.